So a couple of things. We did Chris Corriere, as you've seen him, he's been around all over the place. He runs the Atlanta DevOpsDays, and he decided some crazy idea to do a roast of me, which I told him he was crazy. It actually worked out okay. Only a couple of people really made fun of me. But Andrew Clay Schaefer is one of my dear, dear friends. And I was thinking about Ernest. This wasn't even the slide that was supposed to be in here for this deck, and I'll run out of time. But Ernest's presentation sort of nailed it, right, in his Ignite, because then I showed him this slide. And this is, you know, people say I've done a lot for DevOps Days and all that, but like, DevOps Days have done a lot for me. I've got some beautiful friends in this room and through my career, and it's just been sort of an amazing journey. So enjoy the ride. All right, let's start. Whoa, I didn't want to show you that. All right, so the name of this presentation is Learning from History, the Past as a Compass, the System Engineer. Sounds great, right? All right, and you got the book maybe. There's a couple more. But so I decided to add a roast of myself. Is it? Okay. I decided to, since people are roasting me, I figured I'd roast myself. This was back in like 2016. I sold the company to DockerCon. I presented DockerCon. And you know, for you youngins out there, never do a pose like this in a presentation, because some knuckleheads out there will do this. And then they won't stop either. That one I kind of like. I am a musician, so yeah, you know, that thing with the King Kong and the world. I'm pretty old, so that was kind of cool. And then, yeah, you know, I've done some stuff in the water, and that's kind of cool. And then that was my greatest achievement there. So anyway, all right, that's enough of the roasting. You saw my thing. I think this is now the new greatest. Andrew Clay Schaefer is famous for amazing quotes, and this, to me, is the best DevOps quote. I've done a lot of stuff. I mean, look me up. I've written a fair amount of books. Look me up. So I really want to, it's great when a software company has a great leader who you really, really like, who is wicked smart. Oh, that was not. And James Wickett and Dry Run Security, they sponsored a book signing, which really helps me out. It's hard to self-publish a book. So I will admit it, I love James Wickett. All right, so here's what I wanted to sort of do, and we'll sort of calibrate the time of this, because this shouldn't even have been a 30-minute presentation, let alone a 20-minute presentation. I think that as we think about all this AI stuff, and like the takeaway from this shouldn't be I'm anti-AI, all right? And it's because it's hard to be pragmatic about this discussion and not sound like you've taken a side, and that's not even the point of the presentation. I think there's two things that you have to sort of deal with, really three, but I'm really only interested in the first two, which is you have to have a historical perspective of what is going on. So as these things change weekly, and you have these sort of days where everything goes nuts, remember the Deep Seek Monday, I call it, right? Like, I think the history is really important. And again, that's part of why I wrote the book. The book is the heraldry and history of, but then near the end of the book, so I got challenged. The other beautiful thing about the DevOps community is you have great friends. And for those of you who know John Osbar and Dr. Woods, they challenged me when they found out I was writing this book. And the short version of it is they challenged me to take an epistemological view of AI. So we'll talk about that. And so I didn't want to have an opinion about AI. I wanted to just tell you a story of the history of it. And then I kind of got forced. When Dr. Woods asks you if you know who Dr. Woods is, yes, you do your favor, you do it. And so I made my epilogue, this philosophy of AI. And the ethical argument is very important. I'm not trivializing it, but you know, there's so much more I've got to discover before I can have a reasonable opinion on it. So historic perspective, in the journey for me to write this book, now it's 23 books. I've made this list public. I've read a lot of books. I mean, I listened to a fair amount, but and they're amazing stories. And it was interesting to be able to find this arc. And it was sort of by accident it got called Rebels of Reason, because my good friend Damon Edwards, one of the founders of DevOps, I kept telling him along the way, hey, I'm doing this. And he said, you know, it sounds like your book is really about rebels. And I'm like, holy shit, yeah. And it was, and they all had these patterns of these people that were brilliant, and they didn't give up. You know, for those of you who are entrepreneurs, I'm going to do this. And so that was really sort of became the theme. And another thing that when I was writing the book, the really hard problem is that you can't really tell a linear story of the history of AI. So again, I don't have the time to go into all the things that are in the book, but like you get to Deep Blue in like the 90s, then you got to go back to the 50s, then you got to go to like 2010, and you know there's sort of this like don't be a writer that creates your reader a whiplash, right? And so we had this idea that like what if we put it in the way, you know, like if we could have a timeline in AI can count, AI can think, AI can learn, and it sort of worked. So it allowed me to have the freedom to have a linear, mostly linear approach with, you know, where like you're like, wait a minute, like where is he right now? And then it just sets the stage for how this story needed to be told. So why now? This is sort of interesting, right? So I've been doing other presentations about like what's going on, what's the craziness. So this isn't really in my book, but part of it is the stories. Every story on the right there is in the book. But from my research, benchmarking started in 1998 on artificial intelligence, right? That may or may not be true, but at least from what I found. But what's interesting, in 98 is an interesting year. It's the first year that a neural network is actually used in a commercial endeavor. It was basically Jan LeCun was contracted at Bell Labs to basically do for the post office to do handwritten, to recognize handwritten digits. And that's sort of the 101 exercise if you're learning neural networks. But you notice most of the and the other thing, actually, Siri was born. I got a great chapter on the history of Siri. I mean, it is a great, like, Belgium thieves and, like things you'd never even... So, but that was when Janet Breker, who you probably never heard of, Grady started the whole Siri conversation, what became Siri. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. That's Sasha's daughter. She's a cutie. But you notice now what happens here is like 2010, the arcs start getting interesting, right? And like really some crazy stuff happens in the last decade, right? Like, we talked, Deep Blue. By the way, TD Gammon was the first game, or first publicly recognized game that was actually based on a neural network. The actual, the Deep Blue was not. It was more of a rule-based expert system. But you notice here you get to like 2014, 16, things just start going vertical, right? And like, I won't sort of bore you. You've probably heard of the attention is all you need, which is the T, the transformer, and GPT. I mean, all right, so we get to 22. We know what happened then, right? And things are just going straight up, right? All right, so that's cool. Just think about, remember why I've got this slide. It's the why now. Because there's two benchmarks that I sort of pay attention to. I think benchmarks are useful for whatever. but the point is they do sort of give you markers of, like, in this case, what's going on. So this is called the one on the top is the graduate level Google proof. And actually, Joseph is the one who turned me on to all this stuff, right? And if you look at 2024 June, the GPQA, and the idea there is, very loosely speaking, it's what would a graduate student do at this level to answer questions for another subject at a graduate level, right? And so it was in 2024 June, it was 60%, and then human eval is one of the coding evaluation benchmarks. It was at 70%. Now look where it's at right now. The GPQA is at 84% with the Gemini 2.5, and coding is at, I mean, literally, this is insane. We are within 1 point of like 6 or 7 models. They're at 98%, where we were literally at 70% last summer. Right? And you ain't seen nothing yet, folks. This is our DevOpsing story. So, a little over a year ago, there was a benchmark called SWE-Bench, S-W-E Bench. And it basically, again, I'm really bastardizing these definitions, but I'll blame it on the 20 minutes. It is basically, the idea, if you took a GitHub issue, how well would it solve that problem? And it was at 2%. And then these knucklehead kids that were gaming, got funded by Peter Thiel, disaster movie, created this thing called Devon, and it jumped up to a 9%. Oh my God, crazy stuff. And by April, a week later, there were about 10 people who beat them by about 3%, 12%. Look where we're at right now. This chart I took 3 days ago. We're at 60%, like hovering over 60%. So in a year, the reasoning models for solving problems have gone from 2% to like 62, 60 percentage points. I mean, this is no joke stuff, man. So I told you that I got challenged on this idea of, by, again, when Dr. Woods and John Osborne asked you to do a favor, you do it. And they were afraid I was going to write a book about how glorious ChatGPT is, and they knew I wasn't stupid enough to make a book about how to get rich on GPT, but they were a little worried that I was going to over-glorify thinking machines. And I had no intention of doing that. But I really did have no intention of even giving you my opinion about thinking machines. AGI, is it going to happen? I don't care. I really don't. So I wrote this epilogue, and I've wrote it like 4 times within the last 3 weeks. It's like when you finish a book and you realize you got to write an epilogue, and okay. And I'm actually going to make a final change. The book goes to print on Monday, so. But it's I don't know what prize I give if you could name who those 4 people are. If you name anybody, can name the person on the right. Yeah, who said that? Oh, you're cheating. Not him. He's not allowed to answer that question. So a good friend of mine, Lakash, he basically, as we were sort of going through this journey together, he said that to study science, you have to understand the philosophy of science. And he poses that to study AI, you have to understand the philosophy of AI. Right? I'm all in. I agree. In fact, I didn't get today to propose an open spaces. I was going to actually have an open spaces on let's talk about, because I don't have the answer. I know where we need to start, but I don't know what the philosophy of AI is going to be an interesting. And here's the thing: we have to start that conversation now. Just like a couple of 200, 300, 400 Francis Bacon, we needed to start that conversation on science. We need to think. I don't know what the answers are and what the sort of questions are and all. I mean, I got some of the questions. And then in my book, in my epilogue, I realized this was something. The original intent of the book was humans' quest to create a thinking machine, even going back from Boole and Babbage, Ada Lovelace. But one of the things, and I'll sort of nail this story in a minute, which is we've been on a quest to build a machine that thinks like humans. I mean, you can go back to Ada Lovelace, you can go to Turing, which are all in the book, right? All these people. It never occurred to us that we might build a machine that thinks differently. So hold that thought for a second, right? That yes, it is a thinking machine, but it's not a human thinking machine. Deep, right, for a Friday, and everybody wants to get out of here. So I had the thing I'm pretty good at is coming up with creative ideas. Turns out a bunch of other people had the same idea, and I didn't know it. But you ever see the movie Arrival? Yeah. It's a great movie, right? But it actually applies to this philosophy of AI. So this Dr. Banks is a linguist, right? And so in the beginning of the movie, and there's a couple pieces that you have to play it back 10 times to find out these little nuggets. So basically what happens is, these 18 whatever hepapods land. Nobody knows what's going on, right? There's a lot of sort of scary stuff going on. And they go to her because they can't communicate with it, right? And they figure, well, let me go to the top linguist in the world. And basically they ask her, and she says, well, I'm going to have to meet him. And the general guy says, no way. And she says, well, and see you later. And he starts walking out, and she says, oh, she goes, are you going to such and such, which is probably the second best linguist. And he goes, yeah, maybe. No, he says maybe, right, military people, right. And she says, well, ask him what his definition in Sanskrit is for war. All right. So then the helicopter lands on her lawn the next one. So obviously he didn't answer the question correctly. It's like it comes, and she says, and again, you can hardly hear it. She says, what was his answer? And he says, argument. And that's all they do in the book. Then I found a Reddit article, a bunch of linguists who were literally spending 50 days discussing this. Turns out in Sanskrit, it means 2 cows. Or more cows. It's more cows. But here's the point. Our dialogue and our communication and how we commute with aliens. And by the way, AI is an alien thinking machine. Remember that last quote I just talked about, is that like we tried to create a machine that thinks like us? So here's the alternate scenario. Dr. Banks goes to these aliens. So what does she do? She uses scientific method. She uses an epistemological approach. I would argue, and I actually throw some Deming in there, that she literally uses abductive reasoning, and I'll talk about that, to sort of figure out, that there's a space and time difference in how they mean things. But she basically, the alternative view would have been maybe the second guy, if he would have not answered the question correctly, or would have gone in and say, all right, aliens, can you ride a bicycle? You can't ride a bicycle. Can you wash dishes? How about this math problem? Oh, you got it wrong. That's what we're doing right now with this thing. We are spending so much time wasting these comparisons of a machine that we think is in our... So that's why I hate the AGI argument. The AGI is a waste of time. The real discussion is what Dr. Banks is let's accept it's an alien machine, and let's figure out how to communicate it and work with it. And I know I'm sounding like, Pollyanna-ish now, but I mean, I think that I just sort of... Ethan Mollick is a great writer. He's one of the books I've written on the history of AI. But like every day he's doing this sort of Turing test of how well the next model figured out how to do this puzzle. And like, I think we could be doing a lot better use of our brains and thinking about this stuff, right? So, when we talk about sort of a philosophy or epistemology, right, you could say, and apologetics to anybody who is a career AI ML expert, you have free reign to punch me in the nose after this presentation for a reductive 20-minute presentation, 5 minutes, well, there you go. Deductive reasoning is basically your expert systems. And I kind of go through this in the thing, right? Like, so if you think about deductive reasoning, it's kind of rule-based, right? What we have today really is, on the neural networks, is like an inductive. It's probabilistic, right? We're doing sort of correlations. When you ask a question, it's math, basically. It's math to see what the next closest thing in a vector is, and it's all probable. And depending on how the words and the sentences and the paragraphs are loaded, depends on what answer you get, which is all probabilistic. But what the argument of Dr. Woods and another guy named Eric Larson, who wrote a book called The Myth of AI, is that we'll never get to AGI, and Joseph disagrees with this vehemently, is because these models can't do abductive reasoning. And abductive reasoning is that sort of Columbo, if you're old enough to remember, like he sort of walks into a murder mystery and says, he's got some instinct, he's got some history, there's knowledge. He's like weaving through inductive and deductive, and he predicts that the one that has mud on their shoes probably do it because it looked like they were at the barn, and that kind of stuff, right? 2 minutes, yeah. So stop wasting time on discussing AGI. All right, so with my 2 minutes, I got to tell you the best story in my book, which means I'm going to go over. Which I do. I don't do it if the next speaker is going to get harmed by it, but I don't know a speaker. There's a guy named Walter Pitts. How many people heard of Walter Pitts? Nobody, yeah. This guy is fat. He's a Goodwill Hunting. He's a real-life Goodwill Hunting. At about 11 or 12, he speaks 3 languages. He's homeless. He gets kicked out of his house. No formal education. He gets chased by a gang, winds up hiding out for like 2 weeks in the Detroit Public Library. What does he do? He decides to pull out Bertrand Russell's 10-volume Mathematica Principles. He reads it, and he sends a letter, Bertrand Russell, giving him corrections. I'm not kidding. This is true shit, right? And Bertrand Russell, he's talking to some piece like, get out to Cambridge now. He didn't realize he's talking to like a 12-year-old kid who's homeless. So it turns out he runs into some other people arguing about some paper at University of Chicago. They get to know him. They're like, oh, my God, this guy's brilliant. He's a prodigy. So they get him all set up, and turns out there's 3 guys, and I call these, so there's 4 people that I think are the Beatles of epistemology, which basically should have been the Beatles of AI, and that's in the book. But he hangs out with 2 of these guys. One's a professor of psychology, McCullough. McCullough and Pitts write this famous paper, which is the first neural network, the calculus, the first neural, 1943, by the way. And the other guy is Jerry Levinson. If you've ever, Jeff Sussner, he wrote a book where he talks about the brain in the frog's eye. Levin is the guy who did that, right? So these are and he does biology. So here's what happens. They need to get him involved in the university. So what they do is they all hang out. By the way, it sounds like they had like wild parties and meant jazz in the 40s. How dare they? They would probably do an acid. I mean, I don't know. But they all night long, they would literally talk about philosophy and like all this stuff. And I'm done like in like 30 seconds. And they, that's a lie. It's going to be 40 seconds. But hey, they do, and then they go to work, right? And so McCullough would go start teaching his PhD professor stuff. Letvin would go do his biology pre-med students. And anybody want to guess what Walter Pitts did? He was the janitor. That's a real life. And then the story even gets better, but I'm out of time. Anyway, thank you so much.